Hi everyone, Ryan Jackson here. I hope you're having a fantastic day. If you're not, you will, because I've got a special treat for you today. I brought my friends Tom Blevins and Chris Papp. They're a couple of electricians out of Denver, Colorado. They'll introduce themselves, but they're electricians and instructors and just all out fantastic dudes. I'm super honored to be able to call them not only colleagues but friends as well. I first met these two guys when they did a class in West Virginia that I attended covering Article 512 for cannabis oil extraction and post production facilities that use flammable materials. Now, these two guys are absolute experts at this. It's so cool because they started right when the process became legal, right? Colorado was the first state. They had to figure out all this stuff on their own, and they have spent so much time learning about this process. So I think you're going to find it really interesting. Whether it's legal in your state or not, you will have these facilities because it's not just for marijuana, it's for hemp. I want to make it very clear, this is not a how-to video. If you came here to learn how to extract oil in your basement, this is not the video for you, okay? We're not going to help you blow up your house and light yourself on fire. That's not what this channel is for. If you're in the electrical industry, I think you'll find this interesting. Even if you're not in the electrical industry, I think you might find it interesting how we get the oil out of the plant and some of the risks associated with those procedures and techniques. So I'm going to go ahead and let you guys watch this discussion that we just had. It ended up being just north of an hour, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So take care, everyone. We'll see you for the next video. So, Chris, Tom, it's really good to have you here. Thanks so much for doing this. And why don't you tell people a little bit about yourselves?
I'll go first, Tom.
All right.
I'm the talker. Yeah, I'm not big on talking about myself, just like you, Ryan, but a master electrician, over 17 years experience, just a true passion for educating the industry, specifically apprenticeship. And we both work at independent electrical contractors, the Rocky Mountain chapter, educating the apprenticeship. And we do other things for continuing education, as well as Colorado chapter ICC, IAEI, and our own side hustle here, ElecTech, for continuing education within the state of Colorado. So that's just a little bit about myself. I'm a licensed master electrician in the state of Colorado.
I love it when Chris goes first because I just say ditto. It's very, very similar. We're involved in many of the same things. One thing we deal with is IAEI, so we do a lot of continuing education with our local Rocky Mountain chapter of IAEI. We also are instructors at Colorado chapter ICC, ElecTech. So very, very basically when Chris is involved, I'm involved, or if I end up involved in something, then I'd like to drag Chris into it because he's as you'll come to find out, a very great resource for code knowledge. And the other thing, Chris has been endorsed for by the EIS of the NFPA for technical committee CMP 13.
Oh, cool.
And
Yeah.
and then I got endorsed by NFPA for CMP 6. So for the 29 cycle. So we'll both end up being on
that's
CMP.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Great.
we'll see you for the 29 cycle.
Yeah. That's fantastic news. And before I forget, and we'll do this again at the end, but before I forget, give these guys a follow on YouTube. Their YouTube channel is pretty new. They're just starting it, but I love the name, Switches Be Trippin', and that's just switches, the letter B, trippin'. So give these guys a follow on YouTube. They're both amazing. The first time I met you guys, of course, was in West Virginia, I guess about a year ago, and you guys taught this course in person, and I just had my socks knocked off. I thought you guys did a tremendous job, and I'm so thankful that you guys are willing to come on my channel and share your knowledge with everyone. So give these guys a follow on YouTube, youtube.com/@switchesbetrippin'. Also, if you want to go to their website for continuing education, it's electech cannabis-usa.com, and I'll put a link below, and you guys can click on that and go to it easy. So, guys, thanks so much. I'm gonna turn it over to you guys, and you guys are gonna kind of steer this ship, and I'm gonna watch and learn again, because you guys know this. You can't just watch one class and be an expert. So I'm gonna learn even more this time, and I'm super fired up. I've got my code book out. I've got my gigantic cup of coffee. This thing is like bigger than a bowl of soup. It's so big I can barely even fit it on the screen. So anyway, share your screens, guys, and knock this thing out, and let's talk about that sticky icky.
There you go. So yeah, to start off, here we are. So just what the presentation really is going to be about, right? It just, as 512 states, we're talking about cannabis oil equipment, cannabis oil systems, using flammable materials. So specific to 512 is really what we're going to be driving at, what we want to kind of talk about. As we've already kind of introduced ourselves, this is what Chris and I have a little bio, and we like to talk about ourselves, as you can tell. It's kind of it's strange to talk about yourself in public. It's a weird feeling if you
It
because
is.
we're just kind of getting started doing this, so it's
That's
a
the
little
hardest part of the whole thing, man. Is when I'm doing a class, and I don't know how many hundreds of classes I've taught, but the first 2 minutes of the class where I have to talk about myself, that's the part I hate. Get me talking about the nerdy stuff, and you can't shut me up. But
right.
doing the whole, "Hi, I'm Ryan, and I hate that part. So I
Yeah.
totally get
So we tried to rip the Band-Aid off and do that first. So, but
it.
so kind of diving right into it, not to basically, Colorado is one of the first, I think the first state to legalize recreational marijuana. We called it Amendment 64, and it put jurisdictions really on their heels. We didn't know how to deal with any of this. It was suddenly legal, and now working for a local building department, both Chris and myself, it's kind of suddenly they're bringing terms, they're doing things. Our state kind of blew up. We literally had tourism. We had a bus. There's a main street down here in Denver called Colfax, and they called it the Green Mile. It had all kinds of dispensaries and tourist grows, and so now I've got an assembly occupancy that should just be a place growing marijuana. It's almost like I now have tours on it. So it really brought a lot of challenges that we weren't used to looking at. I think on the grand scheme of things now, we still have, I believe, this 3,000 marijuana businesses in the state of Colorado, employing 43,000 people statewide. That's of April of 2023.
Wow.
So it's still something that we deal with. It's just now I think we have a much better handle. I wish we had Article 512 back then, but we just kind of had to make it up using everything we could from Chapter 5. So yeah, there were no experts, and so when there's no experts and people are in trouble, the natural thing to do is call an electrician, right? I mean, because we are just typically who you would call in an emergency, right? Electricians. So what we did was we were able to use the NEC. We were able to pick apart pieces of NFPA articles and determine what we needed to do to move forward. And we had a lot of growing pains. We had a lot. In fact, one of the things that we had to do. This is current. These pictures I think were taken probably about September of last year. So we had allowed things going on when we had no idea what it was. So what we're looking at in this picture is a return air vent being used to hold hoses up. We've got a dropped grid ceiling and a bottle of butane in the corner. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. So these are not C1, D1, Class 1, Division 1 rated lights or switches or anything in this room, but we're filling this small room with butane.
Well, that's what I think is really surprising to a lot of people when you start talking about cannabis and marijuana. I know at least for me initially, I was thinking of the plant, right, the flower, and obviously if you light it on fire, it smokes, right? It's kind of the whole point. But that's not the issue here, right? I mean, we've got rooms full of butane and all sorts of chemicals, and we're blowing things up. It's not the plant, it's the process, right? That's really the frightening part.
Absolutely. And there's so many different ways to do it, and there's so many different avenues for people to go down. There's not one standard. So I think Chris is kind of going to be a little bit better at NFPA 420, but we continue to grow. 512 is a great place to start, and I mean, I guess that's a funny pun, but we continue to grow, trying to keep up with this industry. So 420 is going to give us a little bit better direction on an overall scope of what we're going to do, but 512 is a fantastic start for us. And I, the first time I walked into a room and saw stuff like this, uh, it's scary to me. I'm what am I looking at? What is this? I've got if those are what 200 pounds of butane in here, and now I've got a bag of dry ice, and I've got a scale. I think Cheech and Chong when I think marijuana. I don't think the mad scientist.
Right. Yeah, this
So-
looks a lot more like Breaking Bad than Cheech and
Right.
Chong, right?
Right. So you can see I've got a motor down here. Is that going to be used for hazardous locations? Is it not? Is this, I've got lids open. I don't know what's going on. So really what we're trying to do with this presentation is let you guys see these growing pains that we had. Some of the things that I think are most important for us in the electrical trade is not necessarily how to wire seal offs and things of that nature, but when do I use this? When do I actually apply this? How is this applicable to me whenever I come into these grows? So, again, Article 512, it's a great start. And one of the things that I like to relay to 512 is Article 514. Okay, so the difference between 512 and 514, to me, motor fuel dispensing facilities is everyone's completely familiar with. If I were to say, "Hey, Ryan, 5 feet from the gas pump,"
Yeah.
there's not really any confusion.
Right.
However, if I were to say, "Hey, Ryan, in the butane extraction, I need you to be 5 feet from the pressure vessels," blah, 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 blah. It adds a whole different vernacular and a different different feel.
It really does, and during the 2023 process, of course, that was that was during COVID, and we were doing the code revision process all online, going through the proposals and everything. And I was actually able to sit in and watch some of the process that Code Making Panel 14 went through to write Article 512 and determine whether or not they should have this new article. And kind of the idea was, look, the NEC doesn't classify areas for you, generally speaking, right? I get asked all the time, Ryan, I'm wiring a refinery. What's the class 1 and division 2 and all this stuff? And I say, guys, that's not what the code does. The code doesn't classify the area for you. It says if you have this, then you have to classify it as that. But then we do have a couple of articles, like you said, 514, gas stations. We got 10 million gas stations in this country. We should be able to read and figure out and have it consistent. So there was a big debate with 512 as to whether or not we should add this article, because is this a common enough operation to warrant its own article? And are they similar enough to have their own article, or are they totally different? And initially, I'm just going to be honest, initially I wasn't fully on board. I was thinking we don't need a new article every time we come up with a new process. But I do think that this is common enough and dangerous enough that I've really gone full circle, and I think it is a good thing. I'm really glad that they added Article 512.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. When they added it, it was a little bit too late for us.
Yeah.
We've already approved a lot of things we probably shouldn't have. We've probably uh but on the flip side of that coin, I think we got more right than we got wrong.
Mm.
And so, like you said, the NEC, we don't determine the boundaries. And so we'll get into a little bit of that later about how we're going to be determining boundaries. But I like to really compare 512 to 514. It's a roadmap. It's not the end all be all. It's where you start. You're still going to use chapter 5, the whole thing. You're going to use 500 and all that, but it's a good place to start as a roadmap. I like to call it just kind of a roadmap. And again, to give credit to what you guys were talking about, is this common enough? And to share some of the issues, and these aren't just headlines from Colorado, these are now growing across the country. The other thing that I'd say that this is going to be common enough is, and we'll get into this too, is hemp facilities. So it doesn't have to be recreational marijuana. It could be so we're growing and growing, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But really, what you're seeing, or what we're seeing nationwide, is a lot of issues. These explosions, marijuana labs, fires, people dying. It needed to be addressed. So while you may have been against it, I'm glad you got outvoted.
Yeah.
So I don't know if my audio would work on sharing a slide.
Oh, let's give it a shot.
So what I have here is just kind of a collage of video. The first part does not have sound. And you can see what happens is as this guy introduces oxygen into the room, we suddenly have an explosion. Now he's got a room where he's got an extractor. Now he's knocking the extractor over. And what he was doing was he's actually putting a heat gun onto a cannabis concentrate, which we'll go into the details of how it happens. But more or less, it was a butane byproduct that didn't have enough time to off gas. And could you guys hear that?
No.
Well, I mean, needless to say, that just all the news reports from Colorado of incidents, and then there were a lot of private parties, consulting groups. Also, Denver Fire Department was instrumental in gas detection with typical processes and the equipment involved. And Tom touched on the different variables, but most of the equipment here, and we'll get into the different types, rather those that were considered safe by those running the extractions, that claiming, well, it's highly unlikely that any flammable vapors would be released during the process. It turns out, Denver Fire Department were there, and they were working with these groups like who's being interviewed here, and they were well above 25% of the lower flammable limit. So they were going through with gas detection, as much as those, that business owners and all those involved with the process were claiming this is totally safe. It's highly unlikely that there'd be any like ignitable mixtures. Well, again, Denver Fire Department, some of these groups that got involved were really instrumental and helpful, because it turns out it wasn't quite as safe as maybe we had expected.
Yep. And as this video continues to play, more or less, this is multiple news clips of people that have been injured, things that we were facing. I want to say there was, this news clip brings up, there was about 24 different explosions in about a 3-month period. So it brought in a lot of issues into the state, us being able to do these things and not having any regulation on how to use the cannabis oil and post-production, which is a big part of 512. I'm really glad that they added those words, post-production process. And we're going to get into it, but more or less, Chris is really the man with the codes. He's got the stuff memorized. So when it comes down to the actual code language, I like to let Chris break down how articles work and chapters and parts, and I always screw it up. But thanks to your book, Ryan, thanks to your book, and Chris is continually prodding me, I now don't call everything an article.
Oh, perfect. Good man.
Yeah,
Articles are whole numbers, right?
Right.
Well, on those videos that you were showing, I remember watching them in West Virginia. Like I said, the first time I said I got to this class, and it was really jarring. I mean, people both in commercial environments and then do-it-yourselfers, in their basement. I mean, it's no joke, man. People are lighting themselves on fire. People are blowing up buildings. I mean, I don't know if people have actually been killed doing this stuff.
Sure.
I mean, let's just be honest. If they haven't yet, it's going to happen. You play with this kind of stuff and do it without really knowing what you're doing. It's going to happen if it hasn't already.
You're gonna have to pardon my understanding of the time. Time slips by a lot faster the older I get, but I want to say last year, maybe the year before, 7 people died in Los Angeles County
Really?
for an explosion.
Yeah.
I think right around the time we were starting to put some of these slides together. But if you go to look for those accidents, you'll see that they happen all the time, and people are dying. They're not just getting hurt. They may not die from the initial explosion, but when a building catches on fire or they get flash burns and pass out, it's just
right.
People are absolutely dying from this.
Yeah.
That video is difficult to watch. That's part of why we didn't want to share that in West Virginia, but that it's great video. It's part of the drones that are there on site, and the fire department's entering in through a ladder in that Los Angeles County extraction facility. And I mean, just explosions are happening through openings on the exterior walls where they're entering. So,
wow.
But yeah, that brings me to the self-proclaimed NEC geek here. I try to keep it short and sweet. I love that Article 5.12 is here now. If we were part of that process, I would have just said it's about time. It is very common, at least in the state of Colorado. And it was really well done. It's laid out well. There's a lot that can be added, but that's why we revise things every 3 years, right? So it's broken into 3 parts. And we'll really just get into part 1 for me, general, because as we said, it's not the NEC that's going to delineate classified hazardous areas, but around equipment, it is fairly obvious. So it's similar to like fuel dispensers and delineating areas right around the fuel dispenser, or tanks and ventilation openings for tanks. So that's where we'll predominantly kind of spend time here. Part 2, wiring, we're going to pretty much ignore that. If you're familiar with wiring within classified hazardous locations, well, then thumbs up, you're good to go now, right? We know where's Division 1, Division 2 within the classified 1 area. So, and then part 3, equipment, we'll pass it back off to Walter White there, otherwise known as Tom, and he'll kind of talk about some of the equipment. So 512.1, I'm sure, Ryan, you as well, every apprenticeship, I'm like, definitions .1 to every article is huge, right? What does it cover? I don't know how many phone calls I facilitate answering questions, and I'm like, oh, you're not even in the right article. Like, this section isn't even applicable to your installation. So this is not exactly verbatim. We kind of took a page from your book here and changed a few words, but it's close enough to NFPA text here. And that bullet point number 2 is really it. It's going to discuss cannabis oil preparatory equipment, extraction equipment, booths, post-processing equipment, and systems, and keyword using flammable materials. So there are several that do not use flammable materials for the extraction. So, and then it really wouldn't fall under the umbrella of Article 5.12. And then the other thing I like to bring up here before we pull up the next slide, like we talked about, is we know areas around equipment, around the booths are easily delineated. And in Colorado, as far as like section 500.4 and area classification drawings, it kind of leaves it in the air, right? And even in chapter 4 now of the proposed NFPA 420 text, if you're in terrible view, looking at right now, it's public inputs are open. So you can kind of see the draft. They do need hazard analysis, but again, it just leaves it to qualified persons. And then the definition leaves you kind of guessing. So
Yeah.
we've had a lot of help in the state of Colorado with industrial hygienists, and they're primarily responsible for assuring safety of employees exposed to occupational hazards. Well, part of those occupational hazards are fire, explosion, right? Working with flammable solvents. So they've been huge. I know industrial hygienists are everywhere else. And then the other thing is also uh, oftentimes like the area where I work, the building environment is pretty heavily industrial. So for some of these things like petrochem facilities and stuff, oftentimes we'll solicit fire protection engineers as well for building construction, mechanical systems, and some of the fire dynamics and risk controls. So,
And we will do that. We require the basic plan review process in our jurisdiction that you submit paperwork from an industrial hygienist. However, we may require more depending on how much solvent, how many flammable materials you are storing on site. So step one for us is industrial hygienist. Define our boundaries. Then we'll talk about quantities of flammable materials on site after that.
and as promised, this is about as far into depth as we're going to get on part 2. It just kind of breaks down that part of Article 512, right? It's we've got 2 sections within part 2.10. It's going to direct you to Article 501 for applicable wiring methods where area is delineated as a classified hazardous area, and wiring methods not located above booths. 512.13 provides direction there. Part 3, we bring in subject matter experts. I know you're already quoting subject expert matter number 2 here, Snoop. But this is where Tom is really everyone's been really grateful that if this is new to your jurisdiction, state, county, wherever, Tom is really helpful with understanding the process, so you're not walking in like in total shock. I know that the first time I went to inspect one of these, I had no idea, and that equipment that's just feels so piecemealed, like MacGyvered together, and it's terrifying as an electrical inspector. So that's where we're at. So part 3 covers the equipment, and then we're going to kind of dive into more what you would expect to see in some further photos.
So one of the first things I want to talk about with this is going to be the use of the word cannabis. Cannabis is a term in botany. We don't have it in definitions in Article 100. So one thing that I think everyone needs to understand is it's a family of plants called Cannabis sativa. So these plants are covering hemp and marijuana. So cannabis is a blanket term for either hemp or marijuana. It does not matter what the THC content of the plant is. And we'll kind of get into a little bit more of that. So we've heard about CBD oils. I'm not going to get high from CBD oils. Well, because it doesn't have THC, but it's still a cannabis plant. I still extract hemp the same way I would extract THC oil. It's just I'm not going to get those effects from it. I'm not going to get high off of it, if you will. So whoever wrote the article did their research, and I am really grateful to those people that they're using these terms. So because we talked about cannabis when we talk about cannabis versus hemp, or cannabis versus hemp versus marijuana, it is important to know that we have the Farm Bill passed in 2018. So the Farm Bill says it's legal in all states to have a cannabis extraction. So even if your specific state does not have marijuana extractions, you still have hemp extractions. You just may not know about it.
So is it the same process? I mean, I know you're probably going to answer that, but it's ultimately you're extracting oil from the same plant. Is that right?
Yes, it is the same process. What you're what you're going to do more for, they're targeting certain things with different types of extractions, I guess is the best way to put it. And uh, it gets, I'm trying to come up with a way not to overcomplicate it. So
Okay.
if I were to pull CBDs out, I can pull CBDs out of a marijuana plant as well as I could a hemp plant, but it's not legal.
Mm.
It may actually be easier. So if I happen to be, I don't believe it's legal in Nebraska, but they have a lot of good growing area for farms. So I could grow a bunch of hemp with no THC and then have an extraction to extract my CBD. And I'm doing the exact same thing I'd be doing for a THC extraction. It's a different chemical, a different process that I'm going to pull it out. But at the end of the day, the hazards remain the same.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. So you're just as likely to blow yourself up working with hemp as you are working with marijuana. Same, similar solvent, similar process.
And I think the reason, and this is just opinion, part of the reason that I don't think we're seeing such a big issue with the hemp is because these are national companies. These are
Mm.
companies that are already involved in it. They're companies that are literally dealing with the USDA, how to ship across state lines, federal agencies, as well as local agencies. So most of the people growing the hemp, I've found in my experience, seem to be larger corporations with a lot of their own safety protocols. As where, in my experience, the marijuana is a lot of startup companies, smaller scale stuff,
Mom
guys
and
that,
pop kind of stuff,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that could be why we see that. But again, that's my own opinion and conjecture from what I've seen in my micro part of the world.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Um, but but that's pretty much that. So I just really want to point out that when we talk about cannabis, we're covering both hemp and marijuana, although marijuana gets all the glory, if you will.
So the fire triangle, right? And are there easily ignitable mixtures in the air? Number one begins with the hazard assessment. 500.4 gives anyone that's an AHJ that teeth, so to say, or backing that you should definitely be asking for these things. But if you're an electrician, if you're an apprentice, if you're, an estimator, PM, wherever you're at in the electrical industry, you don't have to be on inspector or plans examiner side of things. That number one begins with the business owner, and they need to be transparent with you. And it's going back to dot one of Article 512. What types of solvents are you using? If they're flammable, then that should raise the flag right away. Okay, we need to ask more. We need some qualified people involved to assess the hazards.
Chris, I love hearing you say that because I have preached that for so many years, talking about area classification, right? Whether you're, regardless of what type of facility you're talking about, you have to know what they're doing there. And the only person that can really tell you is the owner. What does
Yeah.
this look like under normal conditions? What does it look like during abnormal conditions? So, I love that you said that, and you use that word transparency, and I don't think there's a better word for it.
Yeah, well, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
Where you initially construction goes through and the design team, architects, engineers, have this great plan on paper, and you're there a year later to do whatever follow up, and you're like, what is all this? Like, oh,
Yeah.
we typically store a little bit of gas here and there in open containers, and it's like, what?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it can be crazy. So, at the time of the presentation, this is where it stood when I researched into NFPA's website that, we're working on NFPA 420, and it's hilarious. Yeah, the number of the standard is something else, but it is NFPA 420. So, and it's in public input stage right now. There's a lot there, so it's going to cover, construction types, materials used, type 1A to type 5, whatever's permitted, means of egress, fire department access, emergency access, fire protection systems, fire detection, alarm communication systems, ventilation, and emergency power systems for electricians. So ventilation, emergency power systems. From what I could tell, speaking with others, there was some additional bonding requirements for possible static dissipation, but I don't see any of that. So
Yeah,
I don't.
Brian Bauman. Brian had told us there was going to be some extra grounding.
Yeah, so
requirements.
some additional like robust bonding to possibly equalize potential, so there is no static
Okay.
fields created. But I don't recall seeing any of that. But I just quickly went through it just a few days ago, knowing we're going to be here with you. So,
Okay,
so
sure.
there's a lot there. Yeah.
And by the way, if you're watching, nfpa.org/420, right? Regardless of which document you want to look at, it's always nfpa.org/title of the document. So NFPA 70, right, is the NEC, nfpa.org/70, or to go to 420, nfpa.org/420.
Yeah, and then while you're there, you go down and you can go to the next edition, and then if you hit submit public input, regardless if you plan on submitting one or not, you can go through the draft.
Nice.
So,
which leads us right into this Article 512, what it covers, what it doesn't cover, and then 420 is, we're not sure. I'm going to start with that, but it appears that
it does.
420 is going to cover a lot of the things that 512 does not, such as specific CO2, the carbon dioxide extraction types. So what I have on this slide is, go ahead, Chris, I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah, there's a whole chapter just for carbon dioxide extraction. I mean, obviously there would be hazards associated for, people working in those facilities. So yeah, and then I'll zip it there, Tom. Sorry.
Right. No, you're good, because carbon dioxide is still an asphyxiant, right? It may not be a flammable. It is still an asphyxiant. You're still going to have some cautions and precautions using it. And so what we've done for the sake of Article 512, excluding anything from 420, the items listed in white are the types of processing and post-processing that do not apply. And the blue wording here is what does apply. So basically ethanol, methanol, and our butane, LPG, hydrocarbons, heptanes, those things. And what is interesting here, and this is kind of where we start to dive into how the process works. This is where we get to, on the left side, if I'm using a ethanol extraction, but yet I'm using a winterization process, then both the extraction and the post-process fall under 512. However, if I'm using a carbon dioxide extraction and I'm using a concentration or winterization, now 512 applies to part of the process. So, and I think this is where not being familiar with cannabis processes could potentially harm you if you're not familiar. And I think that's where the value of going over this material really lies.
So Tom, could you quickly just kind of say what you mean by processing and post extraction, or unless you're going to,
we're going to get into it probably
okay,
fairly heavy, yeah.
Perfect.
But what we're going to do, but so let's talk before we get in the actual process. We'll talk about, Chris will talk about the prep.
Yeah, well, I'm actually not going to talk about it at all. This is the end of it. Like in our experience, it is kind of, it's covered there. We've got some guidance there in 512.20a and as in bullet point 2, but ultimately we've never encountered preparatory equipment. So in real life, if Tom pulls up the next slide, this is the prep. They deliver all of those dried up seeds, stems, leaves, the things that nobody wants, right? The sticky icky's been removed. And now we can extract those oils from what's remaining. And this is how it shows up. So really preparatory equipment, we don't really see it that
so
often.
that those sacks there are seeds and stems.
Yeah.
It's everything.
Oh wow. Okay.
It could be everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now this is what you'll see. So if you see a semi truck going down the road and it smells bad, that could very well just be hemp.
Okay.
But that's literally how they haul it in on pallets on stacks like this and drop it off.
So the preparatory equipment is typically within a grow or the horticulture facility. And what we call the marijuana concentrate production facility, right? The extractions themselves, there's really no prep. It's just, here it is, shipped out on a pallet.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
You can introduce the mascot.
Oh, we got a new mascot. His name is Buddy. He's our pal. So yeah, so we
Buddy
put.
moves kind of slow, I
He
noticed.
does, yeah. His eyes aren't all the way open either for some reason.
Yeah.
But again, we'll touch on some of the post processing. So, and I guess I put this in front of processing for a reason. I don't want someone to be lulled into, oh, this process is just ice water. I'm literally using ice water, and there's nothing flammable. Now go away.
Right.
Because the post processing is an issue whenever you're using these issues. So when you hear these buzzwords, degassing, winterization, solvent tincture production, filtration and distillation, if I'm not familiar with what these actually mean and I'm talking to a jurisdiction or inspector, we're talking about transparency. Well, I was transparent. I told you that I had a solvent tincture production. Well, the word solvent should put your hair up on the back of your neck and say, so you're using ice water, but then you're dumping it in ethanol.
Oh.
Okay,
Okay.
all right. Well, that changes things. So a lot of these language that is very common in the industry. So here's a good example, right? So supercritical and subcritical CO2. I'm not going to get too far into the difference because I assume 420 is going to address that a little bit better. More or less, subcritical and supercritical is determining if the CO2 is in a liquid or a gas state. And then pressure and temperature. So I would look at a CO2. I do a lot of hunting and that kind of thing. So I would look at a CO2 like a rifle. I want to shoot one specific thing out of this plant. I would like to get a specific type of cannabinoid out of this plant. I will use a specific pressure and temperature and strip the plant of what I want out of it with the CO2.
Okay.
All right. So what I have here is an image of a CO2 extraction. He's got a little cylinder over in the back. Those are just CO2 tanks. You can see the green sticker. There's nothing really flammable there. That panel's wide out in the open. I've got wiring above the wall. Nothing there's a problem. But if you pan to the right, so you just look over to the right. What he's got now is he's taking his cannabinoids, his oil, his hash oil, basically, and he's now separating things using solvents like ethanol. Ooh. So now I have a CO2 extraction, which on the face doesn't sound like it really should be a problem for me, but now I'm mixing it with ethanol, and I'm separating fats, natural plant fats, they call lipids, and things of that nature, that I'm separating them out. And what I'll do is I'll take that solvent. It doesn't work instantly. It works over time. They've got our freezer right behind it. They'll take that ethanol jar with the oil and they'll stick it in the freezer for a while. So now the freezer, is that going to be a classified location? So we need to have that conversation with the hygienist. Are you going to be storing it? If so, how much? So on and so forth. So this is how the process can seemingly be on the surface, totally non-flammable, and then you realize that the post-production process contains it. And I put this in there. This is kind of a fun little thing because, again, the vernacular in this industry it's almost like when you're speaking about with electrical professionals and they say, what in the world is he talking about? I don't even know. It's the same thing with cannabis. These are some of the words that you should start saying, oh, I remember that word. Maybe we should look into this. Rick Simpson oil, CO2 oil. They call it BHO oil. Honeycomb diamonds, dab pens, wax shatter, bubble hash, keef, ice wax, CBD oil, tinctures. All these things should be keywords to say, I need more information.
Okay.
That's basically what if we can get across to anybody anything in this presentation, that's really what I want, is just let's gather the information. there's no rush to get these people unsafely moving forward.
Yeah.
And here's an example of some of these. We were talking about shatter, wax. The top left image, you could see that yellow haze. Basically, that's from a butane extraction. That video where we saw the guy catching the room on fire, that's what he was making. So that comes out. So more or less, they put the butane through the extraction machine. It rips off the trichomes from the plant. It comes into this bubbling pool of black goo. You spread that out, you off gas. So and we'll get into this a little bit more, but then they heat it up and you end up with this very, very high concentrated THC from the plant.
Is that what he was using the heat gun for?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So he's heating that up to thin it out, lay it down, getting the gases off of it. And now you've got mostly a THC. So if you wanted to smoke this, it's going to be a odorless, flavorless goo that you get high on. It's basically just ripping out THC, is what it is. And this is the process. So we call it the sticky icky, right? So it's sticky because of the trichomes. The trichomes are what are the little grains that are stuck to the plant. They are resinous. And that's what we're after. That's where the THC resides. So
those little white things on the plant.
Yeah.
That's what we're after.
That's what we're after. That's what we're really after. Where the CBD might come from different parts of the plant. And so where I said that CO2 might be a rifle, I would call butane a shotgun. It's going to strip this thing down to bare bones and give you a puddle of goo, and it's not very specific. So what I can do is I can increase my production. If I'm looking to create more, I can use a butane extraction and create more that day than I ever could using a CO2 extraction. One of the things that these guys do is they take these off, and like I said, it's odorless, colorless, and it has no flavor. So what the CO2 extraction can do is I can extract the I'm trying, the word's escaping me, but I can basically extract the flavor of a particular plant. So I can extract the flavor of an orange. I can extract the flavor of a banana. I could take those flavors and then I can put them back together with the plant so that now my end product has a flavor and a taste that I want.
So you can get like an orange flavored dab pen.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So I can do all these different.
Right.
So I've heard. Right.
I don't know anything about you.
Right. So basically, all flowers, all plants, all these things have these flavors, and they can target them out with CO2. So even though I might have a butane extraction, they might be partnered with a CO2 extraction to combine flavors and get an end product that everybody wants. Because now they're putting these things in gum, like gummy bears, gum, the whole nine yards. So you don't necessarily want to start with something that tastes like you're chewing on a pot plant.
Right.
And so that's kind of where they're going with it.
So I'm just going to pass it right back to Tom. We're going to get into the extraction, but specifically now the equipment. And if you go to the next slide, we're going to talk more about, well, not just what type of equipment to expect, but what's its primary function? What are we achieving here with the equipment? So that's it. And that should just help again with application of Article 512. For me, it can be as simple as what are the solvents used? And oftentimes just forgotten about post-production. So.
Right. And, it's hard I don't want to waste a whole bunch of time on this, but every time I look at this picture, Chris and I went out to this facility, and the guy answered the door and said, well, we just had a fire. And and Chris is giving me a hard time. He's like, you got so excited. You should tone it down. This guy just went through a fire and you're just like, yeah, can I get pictures? So Chris was reminding me that I shouldn't get so excited about other people's misfortune.
It was the business owner who was going to let us in there and kind of run us through the process and let us take photos. And those were the first words out of Tom's mouth when he said, well, bear with us. We just had a fire last night. And you said, that's great news with a smile on your face ecstatically. So,
I would totally say that. I was little sidebar. Earlier this week, Monday and Tuesday, I was teaching at a facility. I won't say what facility, but I was teaching the same class Monday and then Tuesday, right, for basically the day shift and then the night shift. And we were teaching on electrical safety, and we were talking about racking circuit breakers in. Monday night, they had an incident racking in a 6900-volt circuit breaker. It blew up, and nobody was hurt, right? And the equipment they didn't lose the whole switchgear. But Tom, just like you, as soon as I heard, I'm like, okay, is everybody okay? Yes. Did you lose everything? No. Okay, cool. Can I go get some pictures? I mean, that was immediately.
Yeah. So well, I missed the grace of the first 3 qualifying questions and went straight to fantastic.
Yeah.
But yeah, for people who educate in electrical safety, that's the biggest pro, right? It's like, well, that's great. You can learn.
Well, that's
from
how we
these
learn,
things.
right? That's how we learn, and then we use that knowledge to help others learn, right? I mean, you don't learn from success; you learn from failure more times than not.
So long story short, when you do this right, maybe we could take this and use this as an example of when you do this right. This was a converted paint booth. He's got dry chem from other NFPA articles. I think NFPA 101 or 1 maybe. But they've got all their sprinklers. They've got their dry chem. They've got everything done. We have the correct air exchanges. We have everything tied in with a ventilation system. What happened was he had a pure ethanol extraction going on. So it was more or less a bucket of ethanol, alcohol, sitting there, and a Class 1 Division 1 motor seal had failed, and it sparked into the bucket.
Oh, wow.
The bucket caught on fire. He was wearing a lab coat. The lab coat caught on fire. He knocked the bucket over because he got so freaked out, but he didn't even get burned. Everything went off. Everything worked perfect. So
it did what it was supposed to do.
Right. So where I start this presentation out saying, hey, we screwed up. These are some ugly. Well, here's the finished product. This is what we end up with. A much safer product that saves lives. And that's where 512 is going to help give us direction all the way around. And so even though it sounded terrible, I'm saying great. This is a wonderful example of when applied properly, this saves lives.
Yeah.
Well, personnel and equipment. I mean, the business owner was thrilled too that there was little to be replaced. So, I mean, it's always forgotten too that it's not just covering safety for personnel, it's equipment as well.
Well, yeah, and that's so much of what we do in the electrical industry. When we look at codes and standards, we want things to work, obviously, but when they stop working, we want them to stop working safely, right? That's really the key.
Right. So moving right along, we talked about an ice water extraction. We looked at those trichomes. So this is more or less a very expensive washing machine. I've got ice water knocking the trichomes off the plant. It's very low yield. So you are not probably going to see this from anyone who's trying to make a lot of money. It's going to be a low yield process, but there's going to be no flammable products in there. You shouldn't have to worry. If they say I'm just doing an ice water extraction, you could probably just move on with your day and ask them now, okay, what does your post-extraction process look like?
That's what I was going to ask. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's the extraction and the post. Always make sure you know both of them then.
Right.
Okay, cool.
So again, CO2 extraction, what I've got here on the image on the left is a CO2 extraction. On the right, this is a butane extraction. And if you aren't familiar with what the difference is, they look almost the same.
Yeah.
All right. So I like to use this as a indicator that you need to ask more questions. All right. So go up there and take a look. Is that got a green CO2 label on it? If not, is it got a brown? Is it some kind of BHO? Is it a butane, heptane type machine? One of the key things you're going to see, and I don't think you could see it in any of my photos, I'm going to have to get a better photo, is the tank for the butane is almost always sitting on a scale. All right. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to weigh how much butane left and how much butane has been returned in what is commonly referred to as a closed loop system. Okay. So not necessarily a code term, which I actually thought it was, but it's a closed loop system. So what leaves the tank should be returned back to the tank in that butane extraction.
So if you see a scale and a tank on it, that should raise some flags.
That should raise some flags to you.
Got it.
Right. So we're talking about open loop, closed loop. I just skipped right over the CO2 because so this would be what would be considered an open loop. This would be a very mom and pop type extraction. And you can see my blue bouncy ball. Really, the top container is where the cylinder is where all the plant matter is. And then it funnels down through a filter. And then what looks to be just a bowl, a stainless steel bowl at the bottom is where all the butane settles. All right. So it's stripped all those trichomes off the plant. It's settled down. Now I've got a liquid butane bubbling brew that now contains trichomes. The process that I'd have to do next is I now have to disconnect hoses and I release butane, everything that was in the cylinder. As you can see here, I now have to move the hose over. And so now everything that with all the butane that is in a gaseous state is now going to be released into the air. The hose, everything is going to be released into the air. I am no longer keeping that 25% LVL per the code recommendation. So Chris, maybe you can help expand on that a little bit later, right? But I kind of want to point that out. So open loop, closed loop, we have different code language for that, but you're going to hear open loop and closed loop. I'm letting a lot of butane out. In the closed loop extraction, what you can't see in the photo, on the back side of this machine is what we almost always refer to as a Haskell pump, which would be like calling every tissue a Kleenex. All right, so Haskell is the manufacturer of it, and so everyone calls them Haskell pumps. They may not be manufactured by Haskell, but in my experience, it's a Haskell pump. And this is a vacuum pump that will literally move the gaseous and liquid butane back into the tank when it's done.
Okay.
So we're wasting less, where we have less coming out. This is another extraction facility. You could see the tank he's got on the bottom. He's got a little jack that's held up there. He's got these hoses that are connected to it in the image.
Oh yeah. And
behind that, you can see, it's hard to see. It looks almost one-dimensional in the photo, but that's a return air this is a class 1 division 1 room. So when he does open anything up, he's got it going automatically into ventilation. He's got the room completely wired as class 1 division 1 all throughout it, like a paint booth. This whole room is.
Okay.
So super safe. And you know what? You can actually see part of the scale on that tank in that image.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Now the open loop then, Tom, is that going to be more likely to be seen in a really small mom and pops type of place, or even, God forbid, a do-it-yourselfer in his basement? I mean,
well, so one of the things Chris gives me a hard time about is those images. That's my living room. So
I didn't want to be the one to say it. I remember you saying it.
So full disclosure, that tank's empty, everything's empty. There's never been a scrap of anything in there. But I had a friend who started telling me about how he was going to be doing these extractions, and he was going to rent a storage unit. And
oh God, yeah.
And so I finally said, "Hey, man, let's do a little education on this." And he finally gave it to me and said, "It's probably more than I bargained for." So now I use this as an education tool for an extractor. It's actually sitting in my office in the jurisdiction where I work, which makes everyone really happy when they walk by. But
very
yes,
much
so
a DIY type of
right. I think
installation
you
here.
could probably buy this for, between $1,000 and $2,000 and,
Okay.
start your own extractions or whatever you want to do.
Right.
But so I got a guy talked about that. This isn't really super imperative, but a quick note on O-rings. When you talk to the hygienist, if you're going through these, you may want to talk to them about O-rings because while a machine, you have to find out what it is listed to use, right? So if it's listed to use LPG gas of all types, that's one thing. If it's listed as a butane extraction, a lot of people will recover their additional or more or less clean the machines with heptane because it's a more easily recoverable gas, so on and so forth. But you need to make sure that everything in that machine is rated for the gases that they're using. So when you go on site and you see, oh, why do you have heptane? Oh, we use that to clean it, or we use that to do that. Pay attention to that too. So I just wanted to throw a note out there that we've seen that quite a bit of time.
Well, on that subject, so I'm guessing, Tom, that your concern is that it's going to eat that O-ring, and then we're going to have an escape. Um, I I read a book written by a physicist named Richard Feynman who investigated the Space Shuttle Challenger.
Mm-hmm.
That's how that blew up, was O-ring failure.
Yes.
It's a real it's a big deal, man. It's something, just a little piece of rubberized plastic looking thing, and yeah, that can be the end of the whole facility. So super important. I'm glad you brought it up.
Well, and as Chris goes along, he's going to explain more about 512's boundaries that it's giving us. Well, those boundaries are based on this equipment not failing. That
Right.
we're not going to maintain a 25 LVL if you've got leaky O-rings. So
Right.
now suddenly everything that we put into place is out the window.
Mm.
And that's really kind of just a point to bring up. But to get through this, ethanol extractions, they literally use ethanol alcohol and they soak the cannabis in the alcohol to get the THC, to get the trichomes pulled off the plant, the THC out of the trichomes. And that process is not like hitting it with CO2, not like hitting it with butane, just pouring butane. This is literally just soaking it. We're just soaking it inside of ethyl alcohol, and it just does the product itself. It takes care of it. And so now that you know these three different types of processes or post processes, it brings up another good point. What do we do, Chris?
Well, so we're going to bring part 2 of Article 512 in, which begins at .3 section, and it covers determining area classifications. So, and there's 2 basic parts, whether the equipment's in a booth or the equipment's not in a booth. So it begins with equipment not in a booth, and that's what Tom touched on. Is I believe when we were going through the IAI Rocky Mountain chapter presentation, that Tom was mentioning in NEC when it refers to open loop, closed loop, which it definitely does not. So if you go to the next slide, those that are, not electricians, not familiar with the NEC, when they're going to walk you through their process, they'll be telling you if it's closed loop or open loop. But so the difference is, this would be an example where it may be considered an open loop would be areas around equipment, not within a booth. But if we go to the next slide, actually, sorry, Tom, it's where flammable gases or vapors are released. That would be an open loop. And then when we get into closed loop, we'll look closer at that. But the way the NEC kind of refers to that is where you can have flammable vapors released under normal operations, but only when you're removing the material, and the equipment would be listed and marked that it's not going to be off gassing or releasing greater than above the 25 LFL. So, but this part's pretty easy actually. So we hijack the images here, If you're within those open loop systems where you're expecting some flammable vapors to off gas, then you will have division 1, and that'll be 3 feet within the equipment, and then from 3 feet to 5 feet is D2. It's all going to be class 1, and then the pits, trenches, depressions, similar,
Oh, sorry.
will remain C1, D1, unless provided with a vapor stop. And we kind of touched on a vapor stop in the NEC as to what exactly is a vapor stop. So that may be a good public input as to maybe some clarity on what a vapor stop is. But so that's in unlimited length when you're in the pit or depression, as most of those solvents are heavier than air. So. Okay, so the closed loop system, and the bullet point is like more closely to NEC text verbatim, is listed equipment that is also marked to indicate levels below 25% lower flammable limit without ventilation when disconnected or opened will require a classified location to be established around me. You can see this type of equipment that's been certified, listed, and tested that it's going to be below that 25% LFL. There's no longer a D1. So it's just division 2, 3 feet around the equipment, minus the pits and trenches are still going to have C1, D1 without the vapor stop.
Yeah, and generally speaking, and forgetting cannabis, but generally speaking, with class 1, you're dealing with flammable liquids and vapors, right? And the vapors produced from flammable or combustible liquids. But division 1 is where an ignitable quantity exists under normal conditions, and a division 2 is where it exists under abnormal conditions, right? Or where it's kind of a buffer to separate a division 1 from an unclassified area. So kind of the idea. And here you're saying, look, if the equipment is marked to indicate that it's never going to have an ignitable mixture under normal conditions, then there is no division 1, because under normal conditions it's not an ignitable mixture, right? So it's division 2.
Exactly. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Love it.
You should write a book.
You can make it in a 3-volume set.
Yeah.
Right, I should.
So the booths themselves, this is when I asked the question at the annual meeting and fooled everybody, right? There's a lot of knowledgeable people there. That any guess if the booths we were dealing with when all this was introduced in Colorado were listed? And everyone shakes their head. Oh no, absolutely not. Well, they were listed, they were certified, just not to the appropriate product standards. So, and there are a couple options now when I search UL Product IQ for cannabis extraction booths specifically, and they have all the associated control panel equipment, anything like that, and air change, everything else that's part of that certification and product standard process.
So if I see a booth, I need to be careful that it's not listed as a paint spray booth. Is that?
Yeah, you would now, and that really opens like I haven't gone that crazy into depth on guide information and further up with the product standards. I wonder just how different they really are.
Yeah.
To be honest. So
yeah, I'm not sure either.
The little bit I've researched online for the 2 manufacturers of extraction booths specifically, the whole sales brochure, the specification sheets, they look totally similar to like a paint booth. So
okay.
I don't know, but yes, if technically, if you're an inspector, plans examiner, you should be looking for those. If it's going to be within a booth, well, then it's got to be listed as certified as an extraction booth.
Well, and if I could add one thing to that, because I think a lot of times we as in the industry, whether we're inspectors or installers, you see something that's listed for class 1, division 1, and you say, okay, we're in business. Well, that's not where it ends, right? There's things like group classifications. If you're hazardous due to the presence of acetylene, you better have group A rated equipment. And if you're classified due to the presence of cyclopropane, that's group D, right? So with a spray paint booth, yeah, the risks are very similar, right? We've got flammable stuff, but that doesn't mean that one is necessarily good for the other. It could be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. So yeah, now that there's listed extraction booths, that's what we need to be seeing, right? Forget the other stuff. We need it listed for that specific application.
Yeah,
and
yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. That's great. Yeah, that would be the biggest differentiators for sure. But yeah.
oh, I have to add into this conversation some of the struggles that we had were also listing of the extraction equipment.
Mm.
So they're not we were seeing a lot come from China that didn't have any NRTL listing on it at all, and we were telling them no. So
Right.
we had, and just food for thought, if you call out, I don't know about all nurdles, but if you call out UL, if you have a Schedule 1 drug on premises, they will not be there.
I've heard that.
So
Yeah.
so if you are watching this because you happen to have a business and you're going to be doing this and you don't have a nationally recognized testing lab certification on your booth, on your equipment, you're going to want to make sure that you don't have any Schedule 1 drugs on the premises. Just food for thought. But
So you're saying if you're going to have a field evaluation, if you're going to
a
have
field
UL come
yes,
out to your facility to do an evaluation, don't have any drugs there when they come because they'll
that's
turn around. Okay, got it.
yeah.
That
Thanks
makes
for
a
that
lot of sense.
clarification. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that makes a lot of sense now that you mention it.
Right. Well,
And
it's really kind of bit some people because those are not cheap evaluations.
Right.
And then the UL guys, you see those big sacks of white bundles of weed, and they're like, no,
Right.
and they
Okay.
leave.
Yeah, understandable.
So yeah, maybe that'll help somebody.
yeah, or the equipment can be brought outside of the facility for the field evaluation. So we've been told by other friends with UL that uh, that may be a possibility as well.
Okay.
Hard to do with a paint booth you're trying to get listed as a cannabis extraction booth.
Right.
So
All right. So the open loop extraction equipment within the booth, basically the interior of the fresh air supply and the plenums, they're going to be unclassified, which makes perfect sense. So,
Right.
again, where's Division 1, where's Division 2? And this is for classifying areas around the booth. Any openings, obviously, there's going to be potential for ignitable mixtures under normal conditions. However, a certain distance outside of the openings, it'd have to be an abnormal condition, and then they'd be Division 2. So closed loop extraction equipment within the booth, same like with an open loop system. I'm just highlighting here again, fresh air supply and supply ducts, including plenums, are not classified. And that brings us to this delineation here. Now we've got that equipment that's listed and marked that during operation, other than disconnection of the equipment to retrieve any plant material, will be under the 25% LFL. There's really no longer a Division 1 because just that's the nature of the operation of that equipment, as you pointed out, Ryan. As that would be an abnormal condition to have any explosible or ignitable mixtures.
So I should have said this earlier because we keep on talking about LFL, and I forget that not everybody is familiar with that
Right.
term, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with any we talk about the fire triangle, right? You got to have gas, you got to have air, and you got to have fuel. So the LFL, the lower flammable limit, if you're talking like gasoline, for example, you have to have at least 3% gasoline in your environment to ignite it, right? If you have less than that, there's not enough gas. If you have more than like 8%, then there's too much. There's not enough oxygen, right? So we call that the lower flammable limit and the upper flammable limit. And what you're saying is we've got equipment that will never exceed 25% of the lower limit. So if the lower limit is 3%, then 25% of that is like 1%. So we've still got a broad range of safety when we talk about 25% of the LFL.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. And so this brings us to post processing. So that's the part that really eluded most of us in Colorado. That
Hmm.
when Tom was saying, well, we're not using any solvents that are flammable for processing
Right.
production. Okay. And it turns out, well, Well, we should have maybe dug in a little further, or asked for, better clarity of start to finish, not 80% of the process. There's really no hazard. It's just the last remaining 10, 15%.
Right.
So with that said, what they'll call winterization, which you'll hear a lot is winterization. And they take the extracted material. So like we talk about, let's use butane for an example, just because it's going to be in a liquid state, bubbling and off-gassing with all the trichomes and goo in it. Well, like we said earlier, butane is kind of more of like a shotgun blast. So I'm also going to be dragging in my fats, my lipids, my chloroplasts, some of the chlorophyll, some of the things we don't necessarily want. It's going to strip it all. It's going to take some undesirable products. So what happens is we take, and CO2 as well, we'll take that liquid oil, we'll stick it in a freezer. And so, have you guys ever left a pot roast out overnight?
Yeah.
It looks a lot like her, right?
Yeah.
Right. So this is the pot roast that you get out overnight, and all the fats rise to the surface, right? So if I were going to make a bone broth, part of the directions are put it in the fridge and then take all the fat off the top.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same exact thing. Why this is important is because I still have a liquid flammable gas in a freezer now. So this is something you need to talk to your hygienist about, because he's may or may not be familiar with the post-processing. That's what we found out, like Chris was saying.
Okay.
So I would open a freezer and say, I've got 9 buckets of liquid butane that was just all in this. Where is that at now? Now I'm in a sealed lid. What is this? Am I still below 25% LVL if I open up the lid? Am I not? I don't know.
Yeah,
But,
what's the flash point of the liquid, right? How warm does it have to be before it's an ignitable mixture? Yeah.
Right. So get some help on that. But that's the winterization process, and that's used in most all extractions. We're talking about solvents. Part of this machine operates under a vacuum. It's called a rotovap. So what they'll do is that big stainless steel bucket on the right is filled probably with like a warm water, and it will rotate that glass globe so it has ethanol inside of it. So I've now got an ethanol to separate my chloroplast, chlorophyll, all those things, and try to just keep my oils separated. What this will do is it will rotate that glass globe with an ethanol inside of that, and it smears it all around the outside of that glass globe. And so because evaporation is a surface phenomenon, think about a cup of coffee. Your coffee's not evaporating from the bottom, it's only from the surface. So what this is doing is creating a larger surface area, smearing it with an ethanol, and then the ethanol is evaporating. But this is, rotovaps are typically closed loop. They're going to recollect all that ethanol in those tubes you see back in the back there. So it's going to be left with just your resin that you're desired based on how long you left it in there and temperature and so on and so forth. It's very much, this entire process is all revolving around temperature, pressures, and things of that nature to get the desired output of the products you're after.
Okay.
So these I'm not super worried about, but you need to know they do contain ethanol. They're closed loop. They don't all look the same. Here's a
that would be a good example of that area around a rotovap would be a D2.
Right.
That would be an abnormal.
Makes
condition.
sense.
Perfect. So yeah. So again, all I'm doing is I'm creating more surface area to increase evaporation. And so that almost always uses an ethanol. Again, it's a closed loop system. Don't need to go too into detail on that. We kind of went through that, but Chris knows a thing or two about product standard testing and certifications.
Well, and there's a lot of great informational notes throughout Article 512. I just wanted to highlight many people are unaware of just how easy it is once you create an account for yourself in UL Product IQ, that
Mhm.
the guide information is a really useful tool.
Hey folks, the audio on the recording got really weird right here, so I had to cut about 1 minute of the discussion. But the bottom line here is go to UL Product IQ, search these product categories out. All right, thanks for understanding.
Whatever.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Orange triangle.
that's a great example because that one, I'm in UL Product IQ all the time, right? Just like you guys. And if you're watching, go to ul.com, go to Product IQ, search it out. You need to have an account with UL Product IQ. It's free. They don't send you a bunch of emails. They're not going to ask you for money, right? But seriously, make an account on UL Product IQ. And right there where it says search, type in RTRT if you want to learn about receptacles, like you were just talking about, Chris, because receptacles is something we've all dealt with. We all know it, right? And you will be amazed at the amount of information about receptacles that's right there, at the touch of your fingers. So love, love, love UL Product IQ. I use it all the time.
That's really, and that was the whole point of this slide. Like you said it better than I could. So yeah.
Can you go back to some of those guide cards though really fast on the previous slide? So you would search in those 4-letter codes, and guys, don't try to memorize or even make sense of the 4-letter codes. They're just a category system, a cataloging system, excuse me. The Q doesn't stand for anything. The M doesn't stand for anything. It's just, those just happen to be the letters that are assigned. So type in those, and that's where you're going to find a ton of information.
Fantastic. Thanks for that.
Yeah, of course.
So I guess what the next thing is that's important when we're dealing with cannabis, specifically marijuana, is the THCA. THCA is converted into the delta 9 tetrahydrocarbonate oil carbonate. I can't say that we're familiar with. Basically, what happens is on a chemical level, when you take the THCA and you heat it up to 240 degrees, that's when you start getting psychotropic effects. Okay. So I can touch, eat, and not be high unless I've heated up. That's why you have to smoke it. That's why you have to dab it. That's why you have to do all these things. So unless it's actually been heated to 240 degrees, not really going to get you anywhere. So this public input was, why don't we also require those working in cannabis manufacturing facilities to be sober? It's it was a very humorous public input.
Right.
I don't know who John Doe is, but he's a funny guy.
Yeah.
So, but ultimately, what we were after here is if you're working around this, just because you're the electrician, if you're an inspector and you work for a state or federal or local agency, and you can't have this in you're not going to get high from simply being in the area.
Yeah, so you don't need to dress up like an astronaut to go do an inspection, right? You're not going to get stoned by walking into the store and not smoking anything.
Right. If it's not heated up, but now edibles are different. Okay, so they will heat up the oils for edibles to knock off that carbon molecule so that you can get high simply by ingesting. But that's done on purpose. And they do that with these vacuum ovens. So they'll put them in a vacuum oven. They'll off gas it. They heat it up just enough to 240 degrees so that that acid molecule falls off. And now if I taste it, if I just put it in my body, then I can get high. So it's a very specific process that they have in order to do that. And I thought it's just important to talk about while we're going through this stuff, that you're not going to get high just walking through or touching some of these things. Vacuum ovens, while we're talking about it, is another piece of equipment that you're going to see quite a bit of. Now, these could be D2 locations depending on what they're doing. If you're going to have to ask questions, you're going to have transparency with the end user. of what's going on, how are they using these ovens, but most of the time they're just trying to heat up the product to 240 degrees, and it's fairly innocent. That said, there's a more dangerous use to these, and you have to be careful, and that's what is known on the street is called diamonds. So what they'll do for these is these are THC, technically they're THCA diamonds. They will take that liquid bubbling butane before it's been off-gassed, and they will put it in a pressure vessel. They will seal it up and allow that gas to create pressure on the molecules, and it will harden the THC into stones. And then heat it. So then they heat it up. So it's under pressure and heated. But now I have a area that I again have liquid butane potentially in jars, and I've made Molotov cocktails and stuck them in an oven.
Right.
Yeah, that's
right.
That's the best way to put it. And they can take different shapes. These are not really common because it's difficult and very time consuming to make. So they'll what they call burp the jars. They'll have these containers that have it under pressure. Then they've got to release pressure, set it down, and it could take 2 months to get these diamonds. So they're a very, very specific product that you're not going to see very often. But if you ever hear them say, I'm going to make diamonds, the point is they're 97 to 99% pure THC. So that's what they're doing. They're trying to make, tailor-made drugs is basically what they're after. And so you just kind of need to be aware that this does exist. Not super popular, but it happens.
Okay.
Trying to wrap this up, it just needs to be, the stuff is everywhere, whether you probably know it or not. And,
well, you made a good point earlier because, where I live, it's not legal for recreation, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to see one of these facilities because, like you said, hemp extraction is the same issue. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah. And these well, go ahead, Tom. I mean, we talked about these bullet points are just kind of nice to wrap things up, but ultimately, for me, you don't have to be as knowledgeable as Tom, right? You can lean on those NEC sections that give us warm, fuzzy feeling as inspectors, the 500.4, and ultimately, what are the solvents being used? Walk me through the entire process, including post-production. Are there any classified hazardous areas possible?
That's it. And just want to really say thanks to Ryan for letting us.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, no, thank you guys. I mean, I think it's great. I seriously, man, I love what you guys are saving lives. I mean, let's be honest here. There's a lot of people, a lot of inspectors, a lot of contractors that are going to go into these facilities and not have any idea where to even start. So, I mean, you guys have been such a huge resource for the industry. This is, I think, the third time I've watched this presentation, and I'm fascinated every time I watch it. Seriously, I really am. So thank you guys, man. You guys are doing some amazing things. And before I forget, electech-usa.com, so spelled just like it is on your screen. Your YouTube channel is Switches Be Trippin', which cracks me up. So give these guys a follow. As clearly these guys are a wealth of information, not just on this, but we've talked on just the code in general in the industry, and you guys are amazing. I mean, like you say, you're both getting ready to be on code making panels, and I mean, you guys are experts at this. So definitely give these guys a follow. You won't regret it.
I really appreciate that. I appreciate the plug and letting us just talk to you. It's Chris and I were on the phone yesterday and just said, who would have thought the 512 stuff? Chris said the last thing I'd ever thought I'd be dealing with is 512 because Chris specifically is an absolute wealth of information for just about every chapter that there is out there, but specifically, it really amuses us that the 512 has gotten so much traction doing this. So if
Yeah.
anybody wants to reach out to us directly, we'd be more than happy to help anyone.
And they can go on your website and contact you that way, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's an email on the website. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Good deal.
But yeah, it's such a small community. So again, it's been awesome, Ryan, and look forward to continued relationship and really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, for sure. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for everything you do in general, and thanks for joining me today. We're making people safer, right? And that's the name of the game. So, thanks so much, guys. And like you said, look forward to seeing you guys on the road again.
All right. Thank
Yeah,
All
you.
right,
thanks.
guys. Right on,
See ya.
man. Thanks.
Goodbye.
Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and ring the bell.